When we first moved into Blue Ridge Lane, it felt like stepping into a dream. The houses were picture perfect, with soft pastel colors and neat little gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Every lawn was trimmed to perfection, and the streets were so quiet you could hear birds chirping in the distance. It was everything I'd ever wanted in a home. A peaceful, beautiful place where my family could grow and thrive. My husband, Sam, joked about how much work it would take to keep up with the neighborhood. I might have to start mowing the driveway just to fit in. He teased as we unpacked boxes on our first day. But honestly, I didn't mind. Coming from the chaos of an old apartment complex where community met noise complaints and parking disputes, this felt like a fresh start. Here, people smiled and waved when you drove by. Kids play outside without a care in the world. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Then there was the HOA, the Homeowners Association. At first, it seemed harmless enough. They sent out newsletters reminding everyone about holiday decorating contests or giving tips on how to prepare your garden for winter. Their mission, according to the welcome packet, was simple: to preserve the charm and beauty of Blue Ridge Lane. To me, it sounded nice. After all, who wouldn't want to live in a place where everyone worked together to make things better? But soon, tiny cracks began to show. One Saturday morning, I found a letter slipped under our front door. It wasn't friendly or cheerful like the newsletters. Instead, it was short and direct. Your mailbox needs repainting. There was no signature, no explanation. Just those 5 words staring back at me in bold black ink. I stood there holding the paper, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Was I annoyed? Embarrassed? Or maybe both? I stepped outside to inspect the mailbox myself. Sure enough, there were a few chips in the paint here and there. Nothing major, but apparently, it was enough to catch someone's attention. That's when it hit me. The HOA wasn't just about making sure everything looked pretty. They were watching us, watching closely, and not in a casual way either. Someone had noticed my mailbox, judged it, and decided it didn't meet their standards. Suddenly, the idea of living in such a perfect neighborhood didn't feel as comforting anymore. Sam noticed the change in my mood when I showed him the letter later that evening. "What's the big deal?" he asked, shrugging it off. "We'll fix it over the weekend. No harm done." But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. That letter wasn't just about a mailbox. It was a sign of something bigger, something stricter. Something that made me wonder if perfection came with a price I wasn't ready to pay. After finding that letter about the mailbox, curiosity got the better of me. Sam suggested we attend the next HOA meeting to see what these people were really like. "Let's figure out who's behind all this," he said with a grin, though I could tell he was more serious than he let on. The thought of going made me nervous, but I agreed. If we were going to live here, we needed to understand the rules and the people enforcing them. The meeting took place in Mrs. Harper's living room. Her house smelled faintly of lavender and lemon polish, and everything inside looked like it had been dusted and polished within an inch of its life. She greeted everyone warmly as they filed in, her silver hair tied neatly into a bun, her smile so bright it almost hurt to look at. About 15 of us squeezed onto floral couches and folding chairs, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs while she sat up. Mrs. Harper began by talking about how important it was to maintain property values and keep Blue Ridge Lane looking beautiful. Her tone was friendly, but there was something firm underneath it, like she meant business. "We're not here to dictate," she assured us, glancing around the room. "Our goal is to ensure consistency." Consistency. That word stuck with me. It sounded innocent enough, but it felt heavier coming from her lips. Consistency meant rules, lots of them. And rules meant consequences if you didn't follow them. By the end of the meeting, she handed out thick binders labeled HOA guidelines and regulations. Flipping through mine later, I realized just how detailed those rules were. There were pages upon pages about acceptable fence heights, approved paint colors, and even the types of flowers you could plant in your front yard. As we walked home, Sam nudged me playfully. "See, not so scary after all," he said, though his laugh sounded forced. He was trying to lighten the mood, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing inside me. Something about Mrs. Harper's overly cheerful demeanor felt off, like she was hiding something beneath all that politeness. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the meeting, or the binder sitting on our kitchen counter. I flipped through it again, my eyes scanning the endless lists of do's and don'ts. Every rule seemed designed to control every little detail of our lives. Did the color of my curtains really affect property values? Was the type of flower in my garden really anyone else's business? Sam noticed my unease and tried to reassure me. "Relax," he said. "It's just a bunch of neighbors trying to keep things nice. No big deal." But deep down, I wasn't convinced. What started as curiosity was turning into suspicion. Who decided what consistent meant? And why did it feel like we were being watched, not just by Mrs. Harper, but by everyone on the street? Over the next few days, I found myself paying closer attention to the neighborhood. People seemed friendly enough, but there was an unspoken pressure to conform, to blend in. Even small differences stood out like sore thumbs. A cracked sidewalk here, a slightly faded paint job there. It all felt like fair game for judgment. The HOA wasn't just about keeping things pretty, it was about control. And as much as I wanted to believe otherwise, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. Things escalated faster than I ever imagined. Just a week after the meeting, another letter appeared under our door. This time, it wasn't about the mailbox. It was about our porch light. Apparently, it didn't meet the HOA standards because it had frosted glass instead of clear. The note politely reminded us that we had 30 days to fix it or face penalties. Penalties. That word made my stomach twist. What did that even mean? Would they fine us? Sue us? Take away privileges like parking spots? Yes, parking spaces were assigned. And yes, that rule was buried somewhere in the massive binder. It felt absurd to think about being punished over something as minor as a light bulb cover, but the HOA wasn't joking around. They meant business. Sam noticed my frustration and tried to brush it off. "It's just a light," he said, rolling his eyes. "We'll swap it out this weekend." But I could tell he was irritated too. He'd been acting strange since the mailbox incident, muttering under his breath about control freaks while scrubbing the grill after dinner. His jokes weren't landing anymore. They were turning into thinly veiled complaints. Then came the real shocker. Jen from across the street stopped by unannounced one afternoon, carrying a plate of cookies. She smiled brightly as she handed them over, saying, "Just a little welcome gift." Her tone was cheerful, but her words carried a sting. "Oh, by the way," she added casually, "I reported your mailbox issue to the HOA board." My mouth dropped open. "You? What?" She shrugged, brushing crumbs off her sweater like it was no big deal. "They asked us to keep an eye out for inconsistencies," she explained. "It's nothing personal, just doing my part to help maintain the neighborhood." Inconsistencies. That word again. Suddenly, I saw Blue Ridge Lane through new eyes. The manicured lawns, the perfectly aligned mailboxes, the spotless sidewalks. It wasn't just pride. It was fear. Fear of standing out. Fear of breaking the rules. Fear of being judged. And if you stepped out of line, neighbors like Jen would report you without hesitation. That night, I told Sam about Jen's visit. At first, he laughed it off. Seriously, cookies and snitching. Who does that? But the more I described her smug grin and casual tone, the angrier he got. So now we're living in some kind of surveillance state. He snapped, pacing the kitchen. What's next? Inspections. Secret cameras hidden in bushes. I wanted to laugh at his paranoia, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be right. The HOA wasn't just sending letters or hosting meetings. They'd recruited the entire neighborhood to police each other. Every neighbor was a potential informant, every glance a possible judgment. Even the smallest details of our lives were under scrutiny. The next morning, I stood outside staring at our porch light, wondering how much effort it would take to replace it. Was it worth fighting over? Maybe not, but giving in felt like surrendering a piece of ourselves. How far would we have to go to prove we belonged here? How many rules would we have to follow before they left us alone? As I looked around the quiet cul-de-sac, I realized something unsettling. Nobody really belonged here unless they played by the HOA's rules. And playing by their rules meant losing a little bit of who we were. Then came the incident with the tree, and it changed everything. One evening, Sam decided to trim the branches of the big oak in our backyard. It was overgrown, its limbs creeping dangerously close to the roof and shedding leaves into the gutters every time the wind blew. "It's just a little pruning," he said, grabbing his gardening gloves. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, it was our tree on our property. What could possibly go wrong? The next morning, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Mrs. Harper stood there, clipboard in hand, with Karen from 2 houses down by her side. If you've ever met someone like Karen, you know exactly what I mean. Perfectly styled hair, yoga pants that looked like they cost more than my weekly grocery bill, and an air of superiority that made my skin crawl. "Good morning," Mrs. Harper chirped, her voice sickly sweet but laced with authority. "We need access to your backyard." I blinked, confused. "Excuse me." Karen stepped forward, arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Your tree branches are hanging over into my property line," she declared, her tone dripping with indignation. "They're blocking sunlight from my gardenias. This is unacceptable." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Wait, you're telling me you want to come into our yard because of some branches?" Mrs. Harper held up her phone, scrolling through photos as if presenting evidence in court. "See here," she said, pointing to a blurry picture of a tree branch casting shade on what I assumed was Karen's prized flowers. "These clearly extend beyond your property boundary. They're a violation of HOA guidelines." My blood boiled. "And you think that gives you the right to barge onto our land?" Karen sniffed, looking offended. "If you won't comply, we'll have no choice but to involve the authorities." "The authorities?" I repeated, incredulous. "You're calling the police over a tree branch." Sam walked in halfway through the conversation, his expression darkening when he saw who was at the door. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Mrs. Harper explained their case again, her tone icy now. "Rules are rules, Mr. Carter. If you refuse to address this, we will escalate the matter." Escalate. The word hung in the air like a storm cloud. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was this really happening? Were they serious about involving law enforcement over a few stray branches? Sure enough, 30 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled into our driveway. Officer Martinez stepped out, looking more bemused than anything else. He listened patiently as Karen rattled off her complaints, occasionally glancing at us with raised eyebrows. When it was our turn to speak, Sam handed him the property survey we'd wisely kept after moving in. "This shows the exact boundary lines," Sam said firmly. "Those branches are entirely on our side." Officer Martinez studied the document, nodded, and turned back to Karen. "Looks pretty clear-cut to me, ma'am. No trespassing allowed." Karen sputtered, her face turning red. Mrs. Harper tried to intervene, stammering something about community standards, but the officer shut her down with a single look. As they slunk away, defeated, I felt a fleeting sense of victory, but it didn't last long. Because now, we weren't just dealing with passive-aggressive letters or nosy neighbors. Now, we were enemies in their eyes. And I knew this wouldn't be the end of it. After the Karen incident, life on Blue Ridge Lane took a darker turn. At first, it was small things that could almost be dismissed as coincidences if they weren't so deliberate. Our trash cans started tipping over every Tuesday night, spilling soggy garbage across the driveway. Each morning, I'd wake up to the stench of rotting food and soggy wrappers scattered everywhere. It was annoying, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was raccoons or strong winds, I told myself. But deep down, I knew better. Then came the flyers, slipped under our door or stuffed into our mailbox. They were anonymous notes accusing us of being bad neighbors who didn't care about Blue Ridge Lane. The messages grew harsher with each passing week. "You're ruining the neighborhood," one read. Another said, "Conform or leave." There was no signature, no way to know who had written them, but the intent was clear. Someone, or maybe several someones, wanted us to feel unwelcome. Sam noticed my growing unease and tried to reassure me. "They're just trying to scare us," he said one evening as we cleaned up yet another mess in the driveway. "Don't let them get to you." But it wasn't that simple. Every note, every tipped-over trash can felt like a warning, a reminder that we were being watched, judged, and targeted. And then the real blow came, a certified letter from the HOA board. Apparently, someone had filed a formal complaint about our backyard shed. Yes, the same shed that had been there since the previous owners. And yes, the one explicitly approved by the HOA years ago. According to the letter, it was now deemed non-compliant due to recent updates to aesthetic guidelines. I stared at the paper, my hands trembling with anger and disbelief. "How is this even possible?" I muttered aloud. "It's literally the same shed that's been here for years." Sam snatched the letter from my hands and skimmed it quickly. His face turned red with fury. "This is insane. How can they change the rules retroactively? What's next? Are they gonna tell us we can't breathe unless it matches their precious color palette?" I wanted to laugh at his exaggeration, but the fear creeping into my chest made it impossible. Because deep down, I believed him. If left unchecked, the HOA would keep pushing until there was nothing left of us, or our autonomy. Desperate for advice, I reached out to Lisa, a neighbor who rarely attended meetings but always seemed friendly enough. She invited me over for coffee one afternoon, her expression unusually serious as she closed the front door behind me. "You need to be careful," she whispered, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "They're scared of you." "Scared of us?" I repeated, confused. Why would they be scared of us? Lisa leaned closer, lowering her voice even more. "Because you stood up to them. People around here aren't used to that. They're used to compliance, not defiance. Now they see you as a threat." Her words sent chills down my spine. A threat? All we'd done was defend ourselves against increasingly absurd accusations. But maybe that was the point. In a neighborhood built on conformity, standing out, even in minor ways, was dangerous. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about power. And the HOA wasn't going to stop until they crushed anyone who dared challenge them. Sam and I talked late into the night, weighing our options. We both knew we couldn't back down. Not now. But the thought of what might come next filled me with dread. Whatever happened, one thing was certain. Blue Ridge Lane would never be the same again. The breaking point came on a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air feels sharp and electric, like something big is about to happen. Sam and I were still in our pajamas when we heard the rumble of engines outside. Through the window, I saw a crew of landscapers pulling into our driveway, armed with chainsaws and work orders signed by the HOA. Their mission? To remove the oak tree entirely. "No," I shouted, rushing outside without even grabbing a jacket. "You can't do this." One of the workers shrugged apologetically, his face unreadable behind thick safety goggles. "Sorry, Mom." Orders from the board. Behind them stood Mrs. Harper, clipboard in hand, her usual cheerful smile replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "It's for the good of the community," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "For the good of the community," Sam repeated incredulously, stepping outside to join me. His voice was loud enough to make the workers pause. "That tree has been here longer than any of you. It's part of this neighborhood." Mrs. Harper didn't flinch. Unfortunately, Mr. Carter, it's been deemed a hazard. Its branches extend onto neighboring properties, and its roots are disrupting sidewalks. The board has made their decision. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just about a tree anymore. It was about control. They were trying to take away something that belonged to us, something that mattered. Without thinking, I planted myself firmly between the workers and the tree. "If you touch that tree, I'll call the police," I said, my voice shaking but firm. Sam stepped up beside me, crossing his arms. "Yeah, try it. Let's see how far your orders get you then." For a moment, nobody moved. The tension in the air was thick, like the calm before a storm. Then Mrs. Harper spoke again, her voice low and venomous. "You've made your bed, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. Now lie in it." Her words hit me like a slap. She wasn't just threatening us. She was declaring war. And in that moment, I knew we had two choices: back down and let them win, or fight back with everything we had. We chose to fight. That afternoon, we hired a lawyer, a bulldog named Frank who specialized in HOA disputes. He listened carefully as we explained everything. The letters, the complaints, the tipped-over trash cans, the anonymous notes, and now the tree. By the time we finished, Frank looked both furious and impressed. "They've overstepped," he said bluntly. "This isn't about rules, it's harassment." With Frank's help, we gathered evidence: emails, letters, witness statements from neighbors too afraid to speak out publicly. Lisa became our secret ally, slipping us documents late at night when no one was watching. We even dug up old photos of the shed and the tree, proving they'd been there long before the HOA decided to target us. When the case finally went to arbitration, the HOA board underestimated us. They thought we'd crumble under pressure, give in to their demands, and slink away quietly. Instead, we showed up prepared, with receipts, surveys, and legal arguments that left them scrambling. Frank tore into their case, pointing out inconsistencies and violations of our rights. By the time it was over, the judge ruled in our favor, not only dismissing all charges, but also fining the HOA for harassment and illegal practices. Victory tasted sweet, but it came at a cost. Blue Ridge Lane was never the same after that. Some neighbors treated us like heroes. Others avoided us like pariahs. As for Mrs. Harper and Karen, they disappeared from view altogether, their reign of terror brought to an abrupt end. Looking back, I realized the HOA wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about power. Power to dictate how we lived, what we did, even who we were. And while we won the fight, part of me still wondered, was it worth it? Because sometimes, even paradise has its price. The aftermath of our battle with the HOA was both a relief and a strange kind of emptiness. Blue Ridge Lane didn't feel like the dream we had moved into anymore. It wasn't just the tree or the shed. It was the way everything had changed. The neighborhood that once seemed so perfect now felt hollow, its charm overshadowed by the tension we'd uncovered. Some neighbors started treating us differently after the ruling. A few even came to us privately, thanking us for standing up to the HOA. "We've been waiting for someone to do something," one man admitted over the fence one afternoon. But no one wanted to be the first. Others, however, avoided us completely. Jen stopped bringing over cookies or even saying hello. Mrs. Harper's house remained eerily quiet, her lavender-scented living room now dark and empty most days. She must have resigned from the HOA board, because we never saw her at another meeting again. Karen, on the other hand, doubled down on her bitterness. Every time she passed by our house, she glared at us as if we personally wronged her. Once, I caught her muttering under her breath while walking her dog past our driveway. "Troublemakers," I heard her say. I wanted to laugh. What exactly were we causing trouble about? Keeping a tree alive. Despite the mixed reactions, Sam and I tried to move forward. Life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could get after everything that had happened. We fixed the porch light, not because anyone forced us, but because it felt good to take control of our own choices again. The mailbox got a fresh coat of paint too, though this time it was because we decided it needed it, not because some anonymous note told us to. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Was all of this worth it? We'd spent months fighting battles we never asked for, pouring time, energy, and money into defending ourselves against absurd accusations. Our peaceful little corner of the world had turned into a battleground, and part of me wondered if we'd ever truly escape the scars it left behind. One evening, as Sam and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I voiced my thoughts aloud. "Do you think we made the right choice?" I asked him, standing up to them. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, staring out at the oak tree that still stood proudly in our backyard. Finally, he spoke. "Yeah," he said firmly. "They tried to take away who we are, what we value. If we'd given in, they would have kept pushing until there was nothing left of us here." His words stayed with me long after the sun dipped below the horizon. He was right. We hadn't fought just for a tree or a shed. We'd fought for the right to live our lives without being controlled, judged, or silenced. And while the victory hadn't come easily, it was ours. Over time, Blue Ridge Lane began to heal, though it was different now. New families moved in, unaware of the drama that had unfolded. The HOA meetings became quieter, less intimidating. Rules were enforced, sure, but not with the same iron grip as before. Maybe our fight had scared them straight, or maybe they simply realized they couldn't win against people willing to push back. As for us, we learned an important lesson. Perfection comes at a price, and sometimes it's not worth paying. Living in a place like Blue Ridge Lane meant accepting certain standards, but it shouldn't mean losing yourself in the process. We found a balance, a way to fit in without giving up what mattered most. Looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. Yes, it was exhausting, frustrating, and sometimes infuriating. But it taught us the value of standing up for ourselves, even when the odds seemed stacked against us. And in the end, isn't that what makes a home truly yours? Not the rules, but the freedom to make it your own.